The 100 Years' War on Palestine, published in 2020, offers a comprehensive and in-depth exploration of one of the world's most often misunderstood regions. This timely book provides a thorough account of Palestinian history, offering a perspective that is centered on the experiences and viewpoints of Palestinians. The British played a big role in taking over Palestine. Before that, Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, and most of the people there were Arab Muslims, with some Jews and Christians. It was slowly getting better with things like trains, electricity, and education. But in 1917, during World War I, the British took control of Palestine and said they supported the idea of a Jewish homeland there, which made the Zionist movement happy. This made the Palestinians worried because they wanted to be independent and not controlled by European powers. From 1919 to 1928, Palestinians asked the British for independence, but they didn't listen. Meanwhile, the Jewish population in Palestine grew because of support from the League of Nations, and this caused tensions. So, the British rule and support for Jewish settlement sped up the colonization of Palestine. In the 1920s and 1930s, Palestine was under British rule, and there was growing tension between the Jewish immigrants supported by the Zionist movement and the Arab majority who didn't want them there. In 1937, the British tried to ease the tension by suggesting that 17% of the land should be set aside for a Jewish state, which led to Palestinian uprisings. The British responded with violence, leading to the suffering of many Palestinians. Then, in 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jewish state was given most of the land. However, this plan didn't work. And in 1948, Jewish militias displaced tens of thousands of Arab families in a violent campaign known as the Nakba, causing a catastrophe for the Palestinians. When it was over in 1949, Israel was established as a state, controlling a large portion of what used to be Palestine. Many Palestinians were forced from their homes, becoming refugees, while others remained inside Israel, facing an uncertain future. The Six-Day War in 1967 was a very short conflict between Israel and its neighboring countries, including Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon. It got its name because it lasted only about a week. The war happened because of tensions that had been building since Israel's expansion in 1948. Egypt made things worse by blocking Israeli ships from using a key waterway called the Straits of Tiran. In response, Israel launched a powerful surprise attack on the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Within days, Israel had taken control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. Even though it was a short war, its consequences had a big impact on the fate of Palestine. Israel became even more powerful, and Palestinian resistance was reignited. Israel had strong support from the United States, which saw Israel as an ally in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The United Nations also played a role by issuing Resolution 242, which effectively confirmed Israel's borders from 1948, and allowed Israel to decide when to withdraw from the territories it had captured in 1967. This led to Israel's continued control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. However, Resolution 242 did not mention Palestine, which meant it didn't recognize the Palestinian people or their rights. Despite this, the war inspired a new generation of Palestinians to fight for their freedom. Writers and political groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, started advocating for Palestinian recognition and resistance. The more militant factions of the PLO gained prominence in the Palestinian struggle after the war. The Lebanon War disrupted the PLO but galvanized the Palestinian movement. It's a sunny Friday afternoon in Beirut. Office workers are strolling home to start the weekend, and families are out on leisurely shopping trips. Then, suddenly, explosions. The earth shakes as several 2,000-pound bombs detonate in the distance. Dozens more follow. This was the opening foray of the 1982 Lebanon War. The hostilities began with Israeli air raids on Beirut, the largest attack on an Arab capital since World War II, and continued with a full-scale ground invasion of southern Lebanon. The invasion is headed by Israel's hawkish defense minister, Ariel Sharon, and his intentions are clear. He hopes to crush the PLO and, in so doing, ultimately quash the spirit of Palestinian nationalism in the occupied territories of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. The Lebanon War was not exactly unexpected. In the decades since the Six-Day War, the PLO had taken an increasingly aggressive stance toward Israel. For the most part, the organization was anchored in Lebanon, where more than 300,000 Palestinians lived as refugees. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, the militant wing of the organization scrimmaged with Israeli forces and often launched rocket attacks across the border. Still, Israel's response was shockingly fierce. Over the course of 10 weeks, the Israeli military pummeled Beirut from the air, ground, and sea. The assault was bolstered by the US, which provided billions in aid along with aircraft, tanks, and other munitions. The PLO returned fire, but their efforts were in vain. The organization was outgunned. Moreover, their cavalier actions prior to the war had alienated them from many allies in the Arab world, who could have helped. In August, the PLO agreed to withdraw from Lebanon. However, the war had already taken a toll. Indiscriminate bombing left the city in ruins and more than 19,000 Palestinians and Lebanese dead, most were civilians. Even after the PLO negotiated for peace, the violence continued. In September 1982, Israeli-backed Lebanese militants called Phalangists massacred civilians at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. More than 3,000 people were killed. In the end, the entire offensive was only partially successful. While Israel managed to disrupt the PLO's main base of operations, its aggressive tactics heightened tensions within the region and tarnished its reputation on the world stage. And, crucially, the concept of Palestinian resistance did not die. Instead, the locus of the struggle moved. In the coming years, Palestinians in the occupied territories would push harder for freedom. In 1987, the First Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, began after an Israeli army vehicle killed 4 Palestinians in Gaza. This event led to widespread protests and civil disobedience in the occupied territories, lasting for 8 years. The Intifada was fueled by growing frustration among Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, who faced poverty and dispossession. It initially seemed promising as a grassroots movement with broad support, emphasizing non-violent tactics like strikes, boycotts, and public demonstrations. However, Israel responded with disproportionate violence. By 1991, the Intifada had pressured Israel into negotiations, but the peace talks were problematic from the start. The PLO represented the Palestinians, but its leaders lacked diplomacy experience and were out of touch with life in the occupied territories. Additionally, the negotiations were overseen by the US, which had a pro-Israel bias. The negotiations resulted in the Oslo I and II Accords, which were detrimental to Palestine. They allowed the PLO to return to the territories and establish a limited form of self-government known as the Palestinian Authority, PA. In return, the PLO officially recognized Israel, giving it control over critical issues like security and settlement construction. While PLO leader Yasser Arafat saw these agreements as a path to Palestinian statehood, they ultimately proved to be problematic for Palestine in the years that followed. A decade after the Oslo Accords, life for the average Palestinian in the occupied territories had worsened. They faced numerous Israeli barriers and checkpoints, needed government permits to travel, and endured humiliating searches and delays even with permits. International trade was severely restricted, leading to a ruined economy with high unemployment, especially in the Gaza Strip. In contrast, Israeli settlers freely moved around and enjoyed exclusive overpasses. The PLO, the Palestinian Authority, did little to improve the situation, mainly maintaining the status quo. This dissatisfaction gave rise to a new group called Hamas, promising radical change. The continued Israeli oppression contributed to the emergence of militant groups like Hamas. The Oslo Accords had offered hope, but by 2000, it was clear that Israel still had significant control over the territories. Tensions escalated during a visit by Ariel Sharon to East Jerusalem, leading to the Second Intifada, which was more violent than the first. It resulted in thousands of Palestinian deaths, mostly civilians, and some Palestinian groups, including Hamas, carried out suicide bombings within Israel. Hamas gained prominence as the PLO's diplomatic efforts failed, advocating a return to armed resistance. In 2006, Hamas won control of the Palestinian Authority, leading Israel to impose a blockade on Gaza, effectively turning it into an open-air prison. In response, sporadic rocket attacks from Hamas prompted Israel to retaliate with overwhelming military force, including airstrikes and artillery shelling. In 2014, Israel launched a major assault on Gaza, resulting in significant casualties and the destruction of neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. Both parties potentially committed war crimes, but the scale of destruction was disproportionately larger on the Palestinian side. The future of Palestine is uncertain, but it's important to remember that peace and justice are still possible. When looking at how colonial occupations historically end, there are three potential outcomes. 1. Complete elimination or subjugation of the indigenous people. 2. Full expulsion of the colonizing power, a rare outcome. 3. Dismantling colonial supremacy and a serious movement toward reconciliation, as seen in examples like South Africa and Ireland. Which outcome will prevail for Palestine is hard to predict at this point. Historically, the attitude of colonial powers toward the indigenous population, as seen in the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and subsequent events, has often disregarded the rights and desires of the native inhabitants. Recent decisions, such as the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and the relocation of the U.S. Embassy, have disrupted established agreements and further exacerbated the unequal political situation. For instance, in 2018, Israel passed a law granting self-determination exclusively to Jewish people, contradicting democratic values and marginalizing Palestinians both in the occupied territories and within Israel. Despite these challenges, Palestinian resistance continues, with movements like BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, gaining prominence. BDS aims to pressure Israel into recognizing Palestinian interests through nonviolent means. However, true progress will require greater flexibility and solidarity among Palestinians and their allies. Both Palestinians and Israelis have strong connections to their homelands, making it essential for any path forward to address this political and emotional reality. While the future is uncertain, the hope for peace and justice in the region remains alive. For over a century, Palestinians have faced the challenge of resisting an unjust settler colonial movement that seeks to occupy their homeland. This project, originally supported by European powers, still receives backing from the United States today. Despite immense pressure, Palestinians persist in their struggle for recognition. To achieve a just and lasting resolution in the region, it's crucial that all people, regardless of their background, are granted full rights, including the right to live, work, travel, and exercise self-determination. This recognition of universal rights is fundamental to building a peaceful and equitable future for everyone involved. On October 7, 2023, Palestinian militant groups, primarily led by Hamas, launched a significant invasion and offensive against Israel from the Gaza Strip. This attack marked the first direct conflict within Israel's boundaries since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It was initiated with rocket attacks against Israel, breaches of the Gaza-Israel barrier, and incursions into Israeli territory, targeting both civilian communities and military installations. This event has been dubbed by some as the beginning of a potential third Palestinian intifada. The Palestinian invasion followed months of escalating tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, including clashes in Jenin and at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, resulting in casualties on both sides. Hamas cited these incidents, along with attacks by Jewish settlers in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, as justification for their attack. The commander of Hamas military wing, Mohammed Deif, called for Palestinians and Arab Israelis to resist the Israeli occupation. In response to the attacks, Israel declared a state of emergency as Hamas militants infiltrated the country, firing thousands of rockets and causing casualties among Israelis. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel was at war. Israel retaliated by striking strategic targets in Gaza and Israel, resulting in casualties, including civilians. Reports of hostages taken by Palestinian militants, as well as violence against Israeli civilians, emerged. For those of you who do not know, the Gaza Strip it is a densely populated territory between Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea, home to about 2.3 million people, heavily reliant on international aid. The attack raises questions about Israeli intelligence failure, despite extensive intelligence services and security measures along the Gaza-Israel border. Hamas breached barriers in multiple places, surprising Israeli authorities. As of the 9th of October, 2023, the third day of the Palestine-Israel war, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and nations of the Middle East support Palestinians. On the contrary, Western nations such as the US, the UK, Canada, EU countries, India, Taiwan and have lent their support to Israel. We truly hope this war ends without causing much damage, and Palestinians get their piece of land that can create and sustain peace in the region.